This is my old Aran cable jumper, and as pretty as it is, you can see that the sleeves are too long, the torso is too baggy, and in general we need to fix this. So, much better. Hi everyone, and welcome back to this channel of crafting, crochet and knitting. My name is Nikki and welcome to my little yarniverse. Today we're going to be chatting about this cable jumper, specifically how I went from an oversized version of this jumper that I wasn't really able to wear anymore and just sat in my wardrobe taking up space, to something that is fitted in a way that I like and that I get a lot of wear out of. Especially this January, because we have had a fair amount of snow and it's been pretty cold. Having this jumper has definitely been helpful. So we're going to talk about the things that went well, things that didn't, and just generally, how we went from an oversized jumper to one that fits. So first things first, let's get our sizes right. Now, caveat to this, I don't really gauge swatch, and I know I should. I know it's wrong, so take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt. But what I'm trying to suggest here is more generic sizing advice and not so much with the gauge swatching, so hopefully this stuff helps, especially because I'm speaking as someone who has had difficulty not fitting into a standard size jumper category, you know, like the average body. That's not what I have been historically, and so these are the things I've learned to deal with that. When I first made this jumper, I did what most people probably do, and I measured my full bust. And then I looked at the pattern and I looked at the size that my full bust fell into. Now with this pattern especially, those size brackets are quite big. On the surface they look like they're fine because it might be 36 and 38, or it might be 40 and 42. And so if you fall into those categories, if you're a size 38, you would do the 36 to 38. Of course you would, because that's what that's saying to you, do this size if your full bust is 38. But if you are 39 inches, then do you go effectively down a size and do the 36 or 38 size, or do you effectively go up a size and do the 40 to 42? This is where ease comes in, and a lot of jumpers will have positive ease, which means that they're probably adding anything from 2 to 4 to 5 inches of material, which means that if you are that 39 size, going up a size is probably not for you, because you'll go up into the 40 to 42 camp, but by the time that the positive ease has been added, you're going to be looking at something like 46 inches of material around your 36 inches of body. It's going to be very oversized. Now if you want the oversized look, then do that, but if you want a jumper that looks like it's fitting you and not necessarily like hanging off of you, if the designer has already put a good 4 inches of ease in, it's safe for you to do the 36 to 38 size. Past me from, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, did not realise this, and I was terrified of making a jumper that would be too small, especially because I was a naughty person who didn't gauge swatch, and so I rounded up to the size that was above me, and I thought this would be fine. I made it and it came out quite oversized. And like I say, part of this is my fault because I didn't gauge swatch. I didn't check that my gauge was on point, but it didn't look problematic. It didn't look very gappy or very tightly made. It looked pretty reasonable, and it didn't not fit. It was just very oversized. And so actually, looking back, the problem was predominantly because I picked the wrong size. So if, like me, you have a little bit of trouble with standard sizes, here is my advice, and that is, measure your upper bust too. Your upper bust is up here, and it is actually your skeleton. At this point there is just rib cage and shoulder bone and what have you, so the chances are that your upper bust measurement will fit into one of those standard sizes pretty reasonably, because for the most part when we vary in size, it's our arm circumference because of muscle or fat, it's our chest because of fat. And so the skeleton of our upper bust is probably more likely to give you an accurate representation of what size you're looking at. Now, granted, not every pattern will give you upper bust measurements, and that's fine too, because it's easier to add stitches to fulfill your bust than it is to take them all over the garment in different places because you've got the wrong size in the first place. So here's what I did the second time round. The second time round, I took my upper bust measurement and I took my full bust measurement. And then I looked at what sizes of the jumper that both those measurements would fall into. And I've lost some weight, so actually it fell into the size below, but more specifically my upper bust measurement was still at the top end of one of those size ranges, and my full bust measurement was still at the top end of one of those size ranges, and my upper bust was at the lower end. But what that meant is that if I had actually been like sitting over a pattern, so like if my full bust was in the next size up and my upper bust was in the size down, knowing that there's positive ease in the jumper, I would have gone for the size down. And if I felt like I was going to need a few more stitches in the full bust, I didn't want it to be too tight there, then I would have added those stitches, especially in something like this where you've got a seed stitch motif, and so it would be easy to hide those extra stitches. It takes a little bit more consideration when it comes to colourwork jumpers. I have been there before, I have had to do that before, but there are some ways around that. Not going to go into them today, but you're better off looking for your upper bust measurement over your full bust measurement, and just use both to try and find a pattern that size that's somewhere in between. So that's what I did. The other thing that I did was take a bit of a gamble on my gauge. So the jumper that I had last time came out oversized predominantly because I picked the wrong size, but it also, I used a at least partially acrylic yarn, and so that drapes quite a lot over time. And I've done this in a few jumpers now where I have used the needle size that looks fine for my yarn weight, so 4mm for DK, that kind of thing, but then because it's mostly acrylic, it's then gone and dropped quite a lot and become quite gappy. So this time round I was going to use a size needle down just to try and combat some of that drape a little bit. It's not something I would see straight away, and maybe the jumper would come out a little bit too small in the first instance or a little bit too tight in the first instance, but over time it is going to stretch because it's acrylic. So instead of using the recommended 5mm for this pattern, I used 4.5, and then when going down sizes for cuffs I also went down sizes and needles as well by the same amount. So that's tip one: get your size and needle and probably gauge correct. Tip number 2 is to have a plan, and what I mean by that is try your jumper on and take very detailed notes about what you do and don't like about this. And this is regardless of whether you are going to frog that jumper back in order to salvage the yarn, or whether you're keeping it as a reference and you're using new yarn for your second jumper, right? You still want to have a plan. It stands to reason that if you are frogging the yarn back, you need to know what you do and don't like before you do that, because once you've frogged, you've not got the reference point. And take some photos. Photos are not a replacement for doing this, because in a photo it might look like it's a reasonable size. I've taken photos of me wearing the oversized one and it looks like it's oversized, but it doesn't look terrible. Like, it's passable, it's just cozy and oversized, right? No, it doesn't fit. It's not comfortable to wear. It's hanging off my body. It's flappy. It gets caught on things. So I try it on and take notes regardless of whether I am going to be frogging it back and have a photo to work with, because only when I try it on do I know how it feels to wear it. And then if you're going to be using it as a reference point in future, if you're not frogging it back, you still want to try it on at the start and know what you're aiming for, because in a pattern it's not just a set length that you're working towards and you'll just stop when you reach a certain length. There are increase sections, there are decrease sections, there are pattern sections, be that texture or lace or colour work. You need to know in your jumper where there is flexibility for you to make the changes that you want to make. You can't just stop it short when you think it's the right length, because you might not have the number of stitches that you need at that point because you didn't account for increasing or decreasing for waist shaping, for example. So we need to try it on and we need to take detailed measurements from the start. And this is what I did. Now, I did not frog back my old jumper, I kept my old jumper, and I did use it as a reference point at different stages just to check that my previous plan was still on track. But most of what I decided at the start was what I implemented as I went. So I tried it on and I fixed my size situation, and then I thought, okay, well, the length is not going to vary too much between the size I was and the size that I'm doing this time. It's like actually in the pattern it was maybe half an inch difference is what they recommended. So I would still be making a jumper that's too long for me in various places if I followed the pattern exactly a second time round, even in a smaller size. So instead, trying on the old jumper and seeing how the yarn had worked over time, how it had stretched slightly over time, meant that what I could do is I could fold for the torso, I could fold the hem up and start seeing, okay, well, where do I want this hem to actually fall? Because it was previously falling too low for me. You might find that you try yours on and it's too cropped, and so in that case you want to measure down from the edge of the hem that you have to where you would like it to sit, and that's how much extra length that you're adding. In my case, I was removing. So in a patterned jumper, it's good to know how long each pattern is and then try to remove or add a pattern or half a pattern, a proportion of the pattern that would look right. So in some colour work I've done in the past, a third of a pattern would actually look better than a half of a pattern because it was sort of rows of 3 or stitches of 3, for example. In this one, this is an even number of pattern rows in the pattern, and so actually half the pattern would be okay, or a full pattern would be okay. So I was folding it up, that hem up, I folded it so that I removed half a pattern. That was not nearly enough. I folded it so I removed a full pattern repeat. That was a lot closer to what I wanted, maybe a tiny bit too long. I tried a pattern repeat and a half, and then it looked really cropped. And so I know that I'm somewhere between a pattern repeat and half a pattern repeat. I don't really want to do a pattern and a quarter. That seemed a bit like it would throw off some of the design. So for example here, at the top of the jumper, so you would work from the bottom up in this one, and you get to this point here, and if I had stopped at a pattern repeat to do the neckline, then that would probably look fine, but I ended up doing an extra half a pattern repeat because I'd worked that maths out, so that I wasn't stopping like part way through a pattern. It was a reasonable amount of the pattern that I was fulfilling. On the back I think it's very, very nearly a whole pattern repeat, but it's not as noticeable because it's working further up my back than it is working on my front, so it looks okay. But I had to do that, right? I had to work out, okay, so, you know, did the old jumper finish where I wanted it to in terms of what row I was on of the pattern when I finished with the neckline? Yes, it did. I want to keep that, which means that I've got to take the length off in other places. I want to take a whole pattern repeat out in other places. I did want to see how things worked up with the new needle, in terms of whether it threw my gauge off a lot. Because it didn't really throw my gauge off too much, I decided that it would be better to only remove one pattern repeat, because I was fine with the jumper being slightly too long. I was not fine with the idea of the jumper being too cropped. So 1.5 run the risk of it not dropping enough in future and it being too cropped. So that's the decision I made with the torso. The sleeves was more complicated. So with the sleeves on the old jumper, they actually were falling down to like here around my fingers, which is completely too long. I think part of that was the weight and gravity over time was stretching the yarn down. I think with a jumper, because it kind of goes around your torso, you can stretch it out a little bit, which sort of balances that dropping effect, whereas on a sleeve it just drops. So that's what it had done. It had gone all the way down there. I think before it was maybe just kind of past here, so it was a little bit long even before, but yeah, it had dropped all the way down here. And I like a short sleeve. I like my sleeves to come to somewhere between my forearm, because I wear my jumpers when I'm knitting, and if I'm doing something with, for example, double pointed needles, I don't want to be knitting away and then snagging into the cuff of the jumper that I'm wearing, potentially flicking stitches off the needle for the project that I'm working on because of that sort of weird force of a needle getting caught. You know, I don't want any of that. I don't want the faff of that. I want it to be a nice smooth experience. So in all the jumpers that I've made in the recent year and a half, I've been using smaller sleeves. And they do look like, oh, did you run out of yarn to finish your sleeves? It's like, no, I want them like this. And you know what? I don't care. It suits me and I'm fine with it. So that's what I wanted. But in the process of looking at the old jumper, I'm thinking I'm going to need to remove about 3 whole patterns to make this work for me. And I know that the construction of the sleeve from the last time I made it is a fair bit of increasing and then also a fair bit of decreasing around the raglan. And I would avoid changing on a raglan construction, I would avoid changing the decreasing for the raglan where possible, because the designer has done that so that it will seamlessly attach to your torso piece. Your torso pieces, your front and back panel, and if you start trying to change the decrease rate or increase rate, and in anything like this, depending on which way you're working, if you trying to change that rate, it's going to affect how it sews to the body. So I first looked at my pattern and looked at how many rows were needed to go from the bottom of the decreasing for the raglan, because you work bottom up with this, how many rows it would take during the decreasing section to finish the raglan, and therefore how many pattern repeats would exist within that row. That was already about half the number of pattern repeats I wanted in my whole jumper, in my whole sleeve for my jumper. So that started me getting a bit worried, because the pattern also said that you have an increase section and then space for some straight knitting so that you continue knitting in pattern until you get to X inches. And so, okay, the easiest place, therefore, to make these changes is the straight knitting portion, right? I can just do less knitting in the straight knitting section. So I also counted up how many rows and therefore how many pattern repeats would have existed if I followed the pattern exactly for the increase portion, and that's when I realised that I would have a problem, because if I did the increase portion of my sleeves in the exact same way as the pattern was suggesting, then I would have too many pattern repeats overall, and the sleeves would therefore be overall longer than I wanted them to be, even if I did no straight knitting at all and I just increased to a point and then decreased to a point. So this was like, oh no, what am I going to do? Am I going to have slightly longer sleeves than I want? Because I think it was only about like a pattern repeats worth that I would be over by. Can I live with one extra pattern repeat? And you know what, I probably could. A pattern repeat is about the size of the four of my fingers on my hand, so if I add that, it would have brought it to my watch line, which would not have been too small for me. I probably could have done it like that. But I had got in my head that, yeah, but your sleeves are going to drop. Your sleeves dropped a lot last time. So even though my sleeves currently look like they're maybe a bit too short, over time they are probably going to drop by a couple of inches. And if I follow the pattern and the sleeve is already longer than I would want it to be, and then it drops, that sleeve is going to be too long. So I risked it and I recalculated the increase rate in that portion of the sleeve, because the pattern was increasing the increase rate was too slow, so I would have more rows and therefore more patterns. If I increased the rate at which I was increasing stitches in the sleeve, then as long as it was balanced, then I would be able to have fewer rows and therefore fewer pattern repeats. So instead of increasing on average every 8 rows, I was increasing on average more like every 6. And I say on average because the increase rate changed slightly. I think because in the original jumper it was increasing at a different rate for the forearm, and then increasing slightly over the elbow in a different way. I didn't emulate that because that was too much maths for me. I just went with a more balanced increase, because I knew that I would be increasing all the way up to the point at which I started the raglan and I would be decreasing. So I didn't feel the need to increase more sharply in one place and less sharply in another, because if I did that, it might look in this, like it might have been obvious in the sleeves. Like if I put my arm out, you might have seen more material somewhere than I wanted to be visible. Whereas I think this looks nice and tapered. It's increasing all the way from here to here and then decreasing for the raglan, and I don't think you can tell. So I'm really happy with how the sleeves came out in the end. Okay, so let's talk about the fun bits now. Let's talk about the mistakes I made. So when I first made this jumper, the most obvious mistake, I don't think I can see any other mistakes in it, but the most obvious mistake that I made at one point was that I did the wrong twisting in this centerpiece panel at one point, and as I was making it, I didn't know enough about the knitting to go back and to fix it, so I kept the mistake and I just made that my back panel, and moved on, hoping that I did better on the front panel and tried to pay a bit more attention, and it did, it worked out okay. But it does mean that on the old jumper there is a mistake on the back panel of the work that no one has really noticed, but I know it's there. And I wanted to avoid that this time. I was paying lots of attention to this. I am a more advanced knitter now as well, so I actually was looking at the the knitting notation and looking at how to do each of those different stitches that are a bit new and scary because they're the cable ones. And there is a logic to it. There is, I started to understand that if I see certain letters, that means that it's going to behave in a certain way, or I understood how the texturing on the cable was trying to move, was trying to bend, and so I could kind of tell that if I put my needles in and I was doing the wrong thing, that it felt wrong, it felt off, it looked off. I could see that now because I'm a more experienced knitter, and this really bolstered me. Sorry, that's potentially not a word that's very good for people who don't have English as a first language, but it rallied me, it really made me feel good about myself, that I could read my knitting in this way now, that I've gotten to this position where this jumper doesn't seem scary. That really encouraged me in my knitting. But there's a saying that we have, which is pride comes before a fall. And as I was knitting this, I made a completely mindless, out of nowhere mistake that I don't understand how I made it. But you've got this, your seed stitch on the edge, which is arguably the most simple part. You've got this XO motif. You've got these here, which are really subtle. I might need to move closer to show you these. They're kind of like a helter-skelter, so they're just 2 stitches long, and they've just got 1 stitch leaning over the other. And on this side, it's leaning this way, and on this side, it is leaning the other way. And then in the middle, you've got the main motif. So that's made it quite symmetrical. And as I was knitting along, I didn't make a mistake in the main pattern. I didn't make a mistake in the XOs. I made a mistake here, in the helter-skeltery part, in the simplest 2-stitch cable pattern part. And it might not be obvious on camera, what's going on with this band of stitching because it's quite subtle. But trust me, if you make a mistake in those subtle patterns, they're the ones that are going to stand out the most. They are going to stick out like a sore thumb. and it did, right? I didn't take a photo, unfortunately, so I can't show you. But when the helter-skelter stitches suddenly go the wrong way, it is obvious. And this was about 4 rows back. What was I going to do? What was I going to do? So I could have reverse knitted or unknit 4 rows worth of work. So I can do this because I know how the needles go into my work, and I know how the loops shape as they come off your needle. I can put them back on the needle again in the same way, and I feel comfortable unpicking my work. Someone incredibly confident with their knitting would just put in like a safety line or put their needle back in to a particular row and then keep going. But I think even very experienced knitters would find that difficult in a cable pattern because you are pulling stitches around in different directions, and it's not the most natural way to look at your stitching. In the end, what I did decide to do was sort of halfway between the two. So I unknit to this part so that I was ready to work down, and I actually laddered down to it. So I put my needle in just below the stitches that had gone wrong, but only in the 2 stitches of this cable, and then the only 2 stitches that I frogged back were the 2 stitches of this cable. I frogged it all the way back down and it caught on the needle, so it wasn't going to go anywhere. So that's laddering down. This was a bold move for me. I have done it before in simple stockinette stitch because that's, for me, I find that easy enough to do. But this was the first time where I was thinking, okay, I've got 2 stitches to deal with. It's a simple enough pattern where one's going in front of the other. As long as I can work out whether I was on a right side row or a wrong side row, then I should be fine. Right? of course, what happened was, as I laddered down, I did not realise that I was on a right side row or a wrong side row, and I assumed I was on one. I laddered back up, or I worked back up, and then I was one strand too small and realised that I had, instead of I can't remember which way around I started, but like instead of starting on a wrong side row, I'd started on a right side row, and I was actually on the wrong side. So I had to ladder back down and then work my way back up again. And unfortunately for me, because I'd already taken out the needle, I laddered down. I put the needle back in one row further down. So I laddered back down, thinking that I was on the side of the row that I thought I would be on, and worked my way back up again, and then had the same mistake and realised that what I had done is that I had changed the row that I was in, and so I'd started from the wrong row again and done the wrong pattern again. So I had to ladder back down a third time, and then I got it right. So that was such a faff to fix. But I was really proud of myself for doing it, because I was pretty scared of doing this. Like, I kind of thought, if I get this wrong, you know, this is going to look horrendous. But I convinced myself it's 2 stitches, you know, how wrong could it go? And yes, I had to do it 3 times to get it right, but I think I was confident that if I kept trying, I would get there eventually, which is what happened. And then I thought we were good. I thought we were great. I thought we were going to just keep going. And I got to a point on, I think it might have been on my back panel actually. Yes, it was on my back panel, where I was at this point here. So you can sort of see that the X and the O starts to get encroached on by the raglan decrease, and so it's not really easy to put the other side of this. Should have been an O, and so this should have been should have had an O here, but you run out of stitches, so it wasn't the easiest thing to position. I decided to do 1/2 to keep the pattern going, and then let this sort of fade into the background, and then up here as well, where I've got too few stitches, that fades as well, and I don't repeat the pattern up there. So that's what I decided I was going to do, except that I accidentally did this side of the pattern here. So instead of it being this archway like this, it was an archway like that. So it was reversed, and I only did this on one side. So when I stepped back, having nearly cast off, in fact, having cast off, like, you know, all the raglan, and I was just at this point here with what was on the holder ready to pick up the neckline, so I wouldn't have been casting off that bit. But as I stepped back and looked at it, I thought, hang on a minute, this doesn't look right. And I was so broken by this, because I thought this would be impossible to fix, because unlike here, where I had those stitches on the needle and I was laddering down, and they would have gone straight back on the needle again, and I would have kept working, I'd already decreased the raglan. So there were stitches that had been cast off, so were not locked in on the needle, that I would have to unpick. And if I unpicked one, it would unpick the next and the next and the next. There was nothing that would catch any of this, and so all of this could have unravelled unless I put a needle in place to catch it. So I've got some photos. I'm just going to lean over here so I can put the photos in. So I've got some photos of this where what I effectively was trying to do was I was trying to put a needle on both sides to try and make sure that I was laddering down to the row I thought I was laddering down to, because now it's more complicated, right? Because instead of a 2-row repeat that only changes on the right side or the wrong side, this pattern changes every 2 or 3 rows, and so I had to know I was on the right row. And as I laddered down, I've had to be very careful with the raglan, so that once I got to the row that I needed to be at, or that I needed to secure it, I was able to put a stitch marker in place to like lock it, so that if nothing else, it wouldn't unravel. So this was a very, very bold move, because I was not prepared to leave it as it was, and unknitting it again would have taken a lot more time. in theory, unknitting it would have taken a lot more time. I now realise that actually unknitting it probably would have taken less time. But I made that decision that I was going to ladder down. And as I did, and as I sat there with my strands of yarn exposed and unravelled, my breathing rate had increased, because I'd suddenly realised that if I couldn't fix this, I'd have to redo a lot. So I was panicking big time. So I thought I knew where I was. I started to work back up, and you can probably guess what happened next. What happened next is that I got to the end and I had a strand left. So I'd clearly done the wrong row. So I laddered back down. Now actually this time what I had done is I had put like the needle in place where I wanted to work up, but then I'd put like a sewing needle or a darning needle just through the row underneath, so I could ladder back down to the same place this time, unlike with my previous situation. So I laddered back down to the same place, again panicking because I had to make sure that I caught the decrease in the right place to stop that unravelling, and I went to ladder back up again, and I got to the end and I thought, this is great, I did it. But why did I finish on a different row than I was expecting to? And as I turned the work over, I noticed that there was a whole strand of yarn that was floating across the back of the work where there was a row that I'd missed. So I was now panicking a lot because I was struggling to fix this. And I was close. I was close to tears. I laddered back down, and this time what I did was every 4 rows, because I'd finished on like at a certain point in the pattern, so every 4 rows I latched the yarn together with a stitch marker, so that I knew that this was definitely the last 4 rows, and then the next one were the second to last 4 rows, and so on, until I got down to my mistake, catching again the decrease to make sure that didn't unravel. And then I did the sensible thing, and I suppose this is the tip I have if you have to do this in future: count how many strands of yarn that you have floating, because that's how many rows you've gone down. So if you're trying to work out what row is on your needle before you start fixing it, count the rows back from the pattern that you know you've unravelled. So like I knew that I'd unravelled like row 12 and then row 11, then row 10 and then row whatever, and then until I got to the point where I had unravelled row 4 but I was on row 3. I was like, right, okay, you know what you're doing, it's fine. I was trying to give myself those little pep talks, and I started on row 3 and I worked my way back up, and I picked up my my decrease at the right moment, and I incorporated that, and I did my decreases, and I got to the last bit and I finished it off, and I stepped back and thought, I think I did it. I think I've done it. And thankfully, I'm not about to tell you that I didn't. I did. I had actually done it. There was something not right though, and that's why I was still like holding my breath a bit. And that's just because the yarn was just ever so slightly looser from where I had been laddering down and picking back up so much, but also potentially from having like tugged on the yarn and tugged on the stitches in a bit of a weird way to give myself that working room that you would normally not need to worry about. So the stitches, effectively like the stitches around the bit that I laddered down, had probably been pulled too tight, which meant that the stitches that I was working were slightly too loose, and I needed to do a lot of sort of trying to tug in the different directions and re-block this section. And it's still not perfect. It's still definitely different from how the gauge is lower down the jumper or on the other side in the reverse. Like it's still noticeable to me, but it's not noticeable. Like unlike the actual mistake, which was glaringly obvious, the gauge being slightly off isn't too noticeable. It's on the back of the work, and the more that I've put this jumper taking it on and off, the more that's just pulling those stitches again, like blocking it back into place. I haven't blocked this jumper, and I could do that, but I think it's fine that just as it's getting natural wear, it's pulling into place. So yes, I was so happy to have laddered down a complicated part of my jumper and somehow managed to fix it. Thankfully, I did not make these mistakes in the centrepiece of the jumper, because I just don't think I would have been able to have done that. That's one step too far. The final mistake that I made was easily fixed, and that is that I got to this part of my jumper and put all of these stitches at this level here at the bottom of the neckline onto a holder. Did the same thing on the back, so the bit that was going to be picked up by the neckline, did my sleeves, so everything was ready on holders, ready to be seamed together and ready to be put in place. Except that as I started seaming, I realised that there was these weird like triangle bits here, and then I thought, well, am I meant to raglan all the way down here? Am I meant to bunch this material together? I thought, no, if I count all my stitches, this is meant to be one for one stitching, and for some reason, why is it down here? And I looked back at the pattern, because there's, you know, this is effectively this weird cutout part. I looked back at the pattern thinking, I don't understand what I've missed. And it turns out that there was a whole paragraph that was like on the next column. So it looked like I'd got to the end of the front panel instructions and then the sleeve started, but there was a whole panel of information that I had just, like a whole paragraph of information that I just missed. And so I hadn't finished the front panel. So thankfully, this was really simple to sort out. So I just picked the stitches back up, or that they were already on a cable, so I just put my needles onto that cable, and then it tells you to like work a triangle on one side effectively in pattern, but there was hardly any pattern to do. I think I had to carry this slightly, this helter-skelter pattern slightly, but we'd got to the point with this XO patterning on the side that it wasn't going to, you weren't going to be able to fit another X or another O in anyway, so it was just a knitted triangle in that portion. So I did that one, and then you just had to cut the yarn and then go back over onto the other side and do the same thing, sort of in reverse slightly. So picking up the stitches in that area, and then you ended up with the middle section stayed on your holder ready for the neckline, and then you had this triangle section that you'd have to pick a few stitches up off of in order to complete the neckline. But it was all in place, and so I could actually start lining it up with the other pieces, start seaming. I did the seaming in a way where I had leftover yarn at each of the 4 points of the raglan, and I had enough yarn to go down the raglan on one side and then either down the sleeve or down the raglan and then down the torso. So there's kind of these, it minimised the amount of cutting of yarn I had to do, because if I just did this, if I did the raglan seam from the top down to the bottom and then back round the other raglan, that would have left me with the sleeve to have to do a separate piece of yarn and the torso to have to do a separate piece of yarn, because all of the ends of my yarn were at the top, because you work from the hem or the cuff upwards. So all my loose yarn was at the top, and I figured that actually, yeah, if I go down one raglan and then the torso, and then on the other side I go down the other side of the raglan, pick it up in the middle here at the join, and then go down the sleeve, that was the tidiest way to do my seaming. So now that I'd fixed the front neck piece in and it was actually in place properly, that's what I was able to do. So yes, I am incredibly happy with this final jumper project. It fits me so much better. Like looking back as well, like when I made the first version of this, like even though I was incredibly proud to have finished the jumper, it didn't fit the way I wanted it to, and so I wore it, but there's a difference between the knitter that I was then and the choices I made then and the knitter that I am now that has been so incredible to reflect on. And I would just encourage you that, yeah, like if you want to remake something from the past, use it as this reflective exercise to see how far you have come as a knitter, because there will be so much more knowledge that you know now, like the tools at your disposal, methods that you know, and it's really interesting, because if you're then going to teach somebody how to knit, having remade something that you made when you were a less experienced knitter gives you so much insight into what new knitters now are struggling with, because you force yourself to make those brain connections that you remember what it was like to be there. It will just make you such a better teacher as well, and so helpful to beginner knitters. And I'm a mentor type personality, so I've just loved this whole experience because of that, as well as having a finished jumper that I wear so much. It has been a pretty cold January. We've even had a bit of snow, so this jumper has had a lot of wear. I refuse to wear my Christmas jumper in January, so I've been relying on this one a lot. So yeah, if you do remake something and realise a valuable piece of wisdom that you have learned over the years, please share it in the comments. I'd love to hear about what your experience is in this area, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!